I knew it was dead because Ambassador Vrethkalos had been speaking for 40 minutes and the only words I had caught were human, compliance, inevitable, and soon. 4 words in 40 minutes. I had smiled and nodded through the rest of it, which, in retrospect, was the single greatest mistake of my career and possibly the most consequential nod in the history of our species. My name is Yara Osai. I am 34 years old. I was born in Lagos, raised on a colony ship after the Vreth hegemony quietly absorbed our settlement when I was 9, and I had spent the last 11 years clawing my way into rooms that were never built for people like me. That morning, I was sitting in the grand chamber of the Galactic Council as the third human being ever admitted to its proceedings, which every species present kept announcing as though it were my entire personality. The chamber itself was the size of a small city. Its ceiling was a living dome of bioluminescent gas, cycling through colors that corresponded, I had been told, to the emotional temperature of the session. It had been a deep, bruised violet for most of the morning. I had assumed that meant something formal and solemn. I was learning in real time that it meant something considerably worse. Ambassador Vrethkalos had 17 tentacles. She used all of them when she spoke, each one punctuating a different clause, a different emphasis. She looked like someone had given a coral reef a law degree and a grievance. She had been addressing the chamber in the Vreth formal register, which my translator bead was supposed to be converting into English at a comfortable half-second delay. Instead, I was getting silence and the faint smell of burnt circuitry behind my ear. I smiled, I nodded. The chamber erupted. Not politely, not in the way chambers erupt when someone makes a sharp parliamentary point. It erupted the way things erupt when the ground opens. Species I had never seen before were on their feet. The Kreth delegation, 6 of them in layered silver robes, had their secondary eyes wide open, which I had been told only happened during seismic events and diplomatic incidents of historic magnitude. 3 council members from the outer rim were making a sound I can only describe as a sustained, harmonic scream. It was not an angry sound. It was the sound of beings who had just witnessed something they could not yet process. Vrethkalos had gone completely still, all 17 tentacles still. She was staring at me. I kept my face neutral. I had learned to keep my face neutral in rooms that were not built for me, because the moment a human shows confusion in a high-stakes chamber, every species present decides the human was a poor choice. My aide, a young man named Colin who had only been assigned to me 3 weeks prior, and who I was fairly certain had never left Earth's solar system before this posting, leaned close to my ear from his seat behind me. "Commander Osai," he whispered. His voice had the texture of someone trying very hard not to come apart. "I think there's a problem." "I gathered that," I said very quietly. The secondary translator on my unit caught the last 8 minutes. He paused. He was working up to something. "You nodded at the wrong moment." I waited. In Vreth formal protocol, a sustained double nod from a recognized diplomatic representative during a sovereignty declaration address constitutes a formal acceptance of challenge terms. He stopped. He tried again. "You've issued a unilateral sovereignty challenge on behalf of Earth, against the Vreth hegemony." I looked at Vrethkalos. She was still staring at me, 17 tentacles still. "How binding is it?" I asked. "Completely," Colin said. "Under Council Charter Article 7, Section 4, both parties have to honor the declaration or face full Council sanctions." I thought about that. How many star systems does the hegemony control? 47. I nodded again. I stopped immediately, because nodding was clearly off the table for the foreseeable future. The chamber had not quieted. The bioluminescent dome had shifted from bruised violet to a red so deep it was almost black. The Kreth Minister of Intelligence, a being named Ashavel whom I had met briefly at the reception 2 nights prior, was holding a data tablet so hard I could see stress fractures forming in its casing. She was looking at me the way you look at something that has just done something physically impossible, and you are trying to decide whether to call a scientist or a clergyman. I folded my hands on the table in front of me. I said, in my clearest council floor voice, I would like to request a 12-hour procedural recess for consultation with my government. Vrethkalos moved. One tentacle it pointed at me. Granted, she said. It was the first Vreth word I had understood all day without a translator. I stood. I picked up my data pad. I walked out of the chamber with the measured pace of someone who had meant every single thing she had done that morning. I made it to the private consultation corridor before Colin caught up with me. Commander, get me a working translator bead, I said. Get me the full transcript of everything Vrethkalos said today, and get me a direct, encrypted channel to Earth Command. In that order. Yes, ma'am, he hesitated. Are you all right? I thought about the 9-year-old version of me watching my aunt pack our lives into 2 bags in 11 minutes, because someone with 17 tentacles had signed a piece of paper that made our home no longer ours. Get me the transcript, I said. He went. I stood in the corridor alone. The walls of the Galactic Council Station were a pale mineral gray, smooth and cold, the kind of surface that reflects your face back to you whether you want it to or not. I looked at my reflection for a moment. Then I pulled out my personal comm and opened the priority channel. My aunt's face appeared on the screen before the second ring had finished. General Adiz Osai, 61 years old. She had the same jaw as me, which we had both inherited from a grandmother neither of us had got to keep for long enough. She was in her office at Earth Command. Behind her, through the window, I could see the across skyline in morning light. She did not look surprised to hear from me. I said, I think I made a situation. I heard, she said. Ashavel's office flagged us 40 seconds after the chamber erupted. We have the transcript. I waited. Yara, she paused. The pause was not the pause of someone choosing their words carefully. It was the pause of someone deciding how much to say. Read what Vrethkalos was actually announcing in that chamber. I'm waiting on the transcript now. Don't wait, she leaned forward slightly. She was not offering terms. She was announcing a timeline, 6 months, your colony, the other outer settlements, administrative absorption. It was already decided. The council knew. They were going to let it happen quietly. The corridor was very still. Nobody told me, I said. Nobody told anyone, my aunt said. That was the point. I thought about the chamber, the bruised violet dome, the Kreth delegation on their feet, Ashavel and her cracking tablet. The way Vrethkalos had gone completely still when I nodded. The declaration, I said slowly, it forced it into the open. It forced everything into the open, my aunt said. Before today, the hegemony could absorb the outer settlements and call it administration. Now it is on the council record as a contested sovereignty action. They cannot do it quietly anymore. I said, I nodded because my translator was broken. My aunt looked at me. Her expression was the same one she had worn the morning she packed our bags in 11 minutes. Not angry, not even grim, something past both of those. The face of someone who has already done the calculation and arrived at the only answer that matters. I know, she said. I didn't mean to. I know that too, she paused, but baby, you were not entirely wrong. The line was quiet for a moment. Earth Command, she said carefully, has been watching hegemony fleet movements for 8 months. We have been trying to find a way to open the conversation in a room the council couldn't close. My reflection stared at me from the smooth gray wall. The declaration, I said. Is the open door, she said, if you can hold it. Colin appeared at the end of the corridor, moving fast, new translator bead in one hand and a data tablet in the other. He looked like a man carrying more information than he was built for. I looked at my aunt's face on the screen. You're going to have to pretend you meant it, she said. Every minute of it. Can you do that? 9 years old, 2 bags, 11 minutes. A ship lifting off a planet that used to be home. I had been pretending I belonged in rooms that were not built for me for 11 years. One more performance was not going to break me. Yes, I said. Good, she reached for something off-screen. Because Earth is filing the formal return declaration in about 4 minutes, we're in. The comm went dark. Colin arrived at my side, breathing hard, and held out the data tablet with the full transcript. I took it. I read the first page. Then I looked up at the council chamber doors at the end of the corridor, large and pale and waiting. Colin, I said. Yes, ma'am. Find out everything the council knows about human military history. I started walking. And then find out everything they think they know. I want both lists, side by side. What are you going to do with them? I thought about 47 star systems. I thought about 6 months and a quiet timeline and a chamber full of species who had been planning to let it happen. I am going to introduce them to the difference, I said. The transcript was worse than I expected. Not because it was cruel. Cruelty is loud. Cruelty announces itself and at least has the dignity of looking you in the eye. What Vrethkalos had said in that chamber was something quieter and considerably more difficult to fight, which was the point. It was the language of inevitability, of things already decided, already moving, already past the stage where objection meant anything. The outer settlements would be absorbed into hegemony administrative zones within 6 months. The council had been informed as a courtesy, not for approval, not for debate. Courtesy. I read that word 3 times. I had been a courtesy too once. The third human admitted to council proceedings. They announced it like an achievement. What they meant was that my presence was a gesture, something that could be pointed to, proof that the council was open-minded and modern and not doing anything that required scrutiny. I sat in the consultation room with the transcript and my new translator bead, and I read every word Vrethkalos had said until I had the shape of it exactly right in my head. Then I closed the tablet, set it flat on the table, and spent the remaining 8 hours preparing for a session I was going to have to walk into as though I had planned it from the beginning. Colin brought me coffee at some point. It tasted wrong. I drank it anyway. By the time the council reconvened the following morning, Earth's formal return declaration had been on the record for 11 hours. Every species on the station knew. The corridor to the chamber was lined with observers from 17 different delegations, which never happens during routine sessions, and every single one of them went quiet as I walked past. Not the polite quiet of diplomatic deference. The other kind. The kind that means people are trying to work out whether they are watching something historic or something catastrophic, and they are not yet sure there is a difference. I took my seat. Vrethkalos was already at her position. She looked exactly as she had looked the day before. Composed. Certain. 17 tentacles arranged in a posture that my new translator Bede's cultural module identified as controlled contempt, which was a posture I recognized immediately because I had been on the receiving end of it for most of my professional life. The council chair, a very old being named Orensal whose species communicated partly through color shifts in their skin, called the session to order. The dome above us was a flat, neutral amber, waiting. The Kreth Minister of Intelligence, HFY, requested the floor first. She stood at the center podium and presented the official threat assessment of Earth's military capacity. It was 12 pages. I looked at the document on my data pad. 12 pages. For a species that had been in continuous armed conflict with some part of itself for the entirety of its recorded history. A species that had come within a handful of decisions of ending its own planet not once, but twice before it was 40 years into space travel. A species that had produced more documented tactical innovations than the next 6 council members combined. specifically because it had spent millennia fighting itself and had gotten very, very efficient at it. 12 pages. I read page 1. I set the pad down. I picked it up again and checked that I had the right document. I did. HFY was explaining, in her precise and careful voice, that Earth's military forces were regionally dispersed, logistically inconsistent, and operationally compromised by the species' well-documented psychological volatility. Psychological volatility. I thought about my aunt's face. I thought about 11 minutes in 2 bags and a ship lifting off a colony planet that would be rechristened with a hegemony administrative designation before the year was out. I thought about what that kind of loss does to a person over the long run. Not what it does in the moment, the grief and the fury and the cold, helpless weight of it. What it does to you after you have lived with it for 25 years. What it builds in you. What it makes you capable of. The Kreth minister finished her presentation. The chamber was quiet in the way chambers go quiet when everyone is waiting for someone else to react first. I raised my hand. The chair recognized me. I walked to the center podium. I set down my data pad. I looked at the 12-page document on the screen behind me, and then I looked out at the chamber, at the hundreds of faces and tentacles and compound eyes, and whatever the Dreth delegation used for faces, which I still had not fully worked out. I said, I would like to add a supplemental note to the threat assessment of Earth. HFY tilted her head slightly. It was a polite gesture. She was expecting a brief clarification, a correction of 1 or 2 figures. I talked for 22 minutes. I did not raise my voice once. I started with history, not military history, not the kind that shows up in threat assessments with numbers and fleet tonnage and engagement records. The other kind. I talked about what happens to a human population when it is threatened not from outside but from within. The way humans had spent thousands of years finding new and elaborate ways to threaten each other, and how that process, brutal and costly as it was, had produced something that no external threat could have produced. It had produced a species that knew how to survive the worst version of itself. A species that had looked at extinction-level mistakes, had looked at them directly and without flinching, and had decided to keep going. I talked about the colonies. I did not use my own history. I did not need to. I talked about the documented pattern of human response to forced displacement. Because the Council had the data, it was in their own archives. They simply had not looked at it through the right lens. Every time a human community was uprooted, absorbed, reclassified, administered, a portion of that community filed quietly into whatever new structure they were given, and then spent the next generation making that structure into something they could control. Not through confrontation, through paperwork, through memorization, through the patient, grinding accumulation of small advantages that looked like compliance until the moment they did not. The Vreth hegemony had absorbed my colony when I was 9. That colony now had 7 of its original residents sitting in administrative positions within the hegemony's regional management structure. They had been there for 20 years. They knew where every file was kept. I did not say any of that out loud. I did not need to. I moved on to the psychological volatility point. I explained, still very calmly, that the Kreth assessment had identified human psychological instability as a military weakness. I understood why. From the outside, a species that responds to extreme stress with what appears to be irrational behavior, that improvises under pressure, that abandons established protocol when protocol is failing, that has an enormous individual variance in decision-making even within a chain of command, looks unstable, unreliable, hard to predict. That was correct. Humans were very hard to predict. I let that sit for a moment. Then I explained the difference between a weakness and a feature that had not yet been indexed correctly. Predictable forces can be modeled. Modeled forces can be countered. The Kreth threat assessment was a model, a very good one, very detailed, based on excellent data. It told you what Earth's military had done in documented engagements and extrapolated forward from there. That was sound methodology for most species. It did not account for what Earth's military would do in a situation it had not encountered before. Because there was no historical data for that. Because in a situation it had not encountered before, a human force did not fall back on established protocol. It invented, immediately, under pressure, often with whatever was physically present in the room. I had been in that room with a Chavel's 12-page document. I had read page 1 and put it down. I said, "The assessment tells you what we have done. It cannot tell you what we will do because we do not fully know yet either. That is not a weakness. That is the variable that your model cannot contain." The chamber was completely silent. I added as an afterthought, "We have also had 8 months to observe hegemony fleet movements. We have been waiting for the right room to discuss it. I appreciate the council providing that room." I picked up my data pad. I walked back to my seat. The Kreth Minister Chavel had not moved since I began speaking. Her secondary eyes, the pair she could not consciously control, were completely white. I had been told that only happened during events of extreme significance. I had been told it was involuntary. I had been told by the cultural briefing document Colin had prepared that it was considered extremely poor etiquette to notice it. I did not notice it. Vreth Kalos requested a recess 20 seconds later. It was the first time in the recorded history of the Galactic Council that a hegemony ambassador had requested a procedural recess in the middle of an open session. Colin leaned forward as I sat down. He whispered, "3 delegations just flagged my comm. They want to discuss alliance terms with Earth." "Which 3?" I asked. He told me. I looked at the council dome above us. The amber had shifted. It was moving towards something I had not seen before, a color that was not on the cultural briefing chart, something between gold and green. "Colin," I said. "Yes, ma'am." "Add a 4th meeting to my calendar. I want to speak with Sev Arlen from the Vreth Junior Diplomatic Staff." I had noticed the young attaché sitting in the observer gallery for both sessions, young, watching, very still, in the way that beings go still when they are calculating rather than when they are calm. Colin paused. "That's a Vreth staff member." "Yes," I said. "Is that a good idea right now?" I thought about the shape of Vreth Kalos's announcement. I thought about 6 months and 47 star systems, and a timeline that had already been decided before anyone sat down in that chamber. I thought about who benefits from an empire that makes its decisions quietly and who does not. "It's probably the best idea I've had all week," I said. "Set it up." The recess bell rang through the chamber. I stayed in my seat. Outside the dome, the station's observation windows showed the deep black of open space, and somewhere in that black, moving in ways that a Chavel's 12 pages had not fully accounted for, Earth's fleets were doing what they had been doing for 8 months. Waiting. Not patiently. Humans are not patient the way other species are patient, the way a stone is patient or a long calculation is patient. Humans wait the way a spring waits, compressed, loaded. Ready. The Vreth ambassador walked out of the chamber through the north corridor. She did not look back at me. I noticed that she did not look back. I filed it. The coffee in the private meeting lounge tasted right, for once. I noticed this because I was the kind of person who noticed when things tasted wrong, having learned at a fairly young age that wrong-tasting things were usually the first signal that something in the environment had been adjusted without your knowledge or consent. The colony administrators had been fond of adjustments, small ones, the temperature in the common areas, the news feeds that came through on the public terminals, the way certain requests got processed slowly and certain others did not get processed at all. You learned to read the small things. The coffee was fine. The lounge was quiet. Sevarlin arrived exactly on time, which told me something, and sat across from me without being directed to a chair, which told me something else. Sevarlin was young by Vreth standards, maybe 23 in equivalent human years. The tentacles were shorter, less controlled, moving in small, involuntary patterns that the cultural briefing identified as the equivalent of a nervous habit. The eyes were a pale amber, which was the resting color for a Vreth not in formal address, not performing, just present. I slid a cup of something warm across the table. The station's kitchen had told me it was the closest approximation to a Vreth comfort beverage that their stock allowed. It was probably terrible. It was the gesture that mattered. Sevarlin looked at it, then looked at me. "You wanted to speak to junior staff," Sevarlin said. The translator bead worked perfectly this time. The voice came through as careful, measured, someone who had been trained to speak carefully. "Why?" "Because senior staff say what they are supposed to say," I said. "Junior staff sometimes say what they know." A pause. "What do you want to know?" I wrapped both hands around my own cup. "Tell me about the sixth system." The tentacles stopped their small movement, just for a moment. The sixth system was a Vreth colonial territory, not a core world, not hegemony prime or any of the inner systems where the actual Vreth population lived in comfort and sent orders outward. The sixth system was a mid-ring territory, resource-rich, administered from a distance. Its population was Vreth by classification. By actual culture and daily life, it was something more complicated. I knew this because I had spent the 8 hours of my recess reading everything in the council archives about hegemony territorial structure, and the sixth system had a flag on its file. Not a big flag. The kind that gets added when someone notices a pattern and does not quite know what to do with it. Sevarlin was from the sixth system. I had not said that out loud yet. "How do you know about the sixth system?" Sevarlin asked. "Council archives," I said. "They are technically public record. Most delegations do not read them very carefully." Another pause, longer. "We do not have a formal voice in the council," Sevarlin said finally. The words came out with the care of someone stepping across ice. "Sixth system sends representatives to the Hegemony Administrative Board. The Administrative Board sends representatives here. By the time the message travels that distance, it does not sound like us anymore." I said, "I know what that distance does to a message." Sevarlin looked at me. The amber eyes were steady. "The absorption timeline," I said. "The one Vreth Kalos announced, the outer settlements, the 6-month schedule." "Yes." "Is it just the human-aligned outer settlements? Or does the sixth system also have a timeline?" The silence that followed was its own answer. I had suspected it. It was in the architecture of Vreth Kalos's original address if you read it with the right frame. The outer human settlements were the announced action, the publicly declared expansion. But the hegemony had been contracting and restructuring internally for 2 years, and contraction at the center meant pressure pushing outward, and the sixth system sat exactly where that pressure would land next. 3 years, Sevarlin said quietly. After the outer settlements are processed, the sixth system gets reclassified. Resource extraction zone. The population will be relocated to central processing settlements. Relocated. That is the official word. I thought about 2 bags and 11 minutes and a ship lifting off. "What would it take," I said carefully, "for the sixth system to file an independent sovereignty petition with the council?" Sevarlin's tentacles went very still. "Under Council Charter Article 12, I said, any territorial population that can demonstrate distinct cultural continuity and has a recognized sponsor willing to co-sign the petition can file for independent status review. It goes to the full chamber. The hegemony cannot block it unilaterally because the petition is a council matter, not an internal hegemony matter." "A sponsor," Sevarlin repeated. "A recognized council member," I said. in good standing with an active diplomatic file. Earth had an active diplomatic file as of yesterday. It was the most active file on the station right now. Sevarlin looked at the cup of warm, not quite fresh beverage on the table, looked at it for a long moment. If we file, Sevarlin said, the hegemony will treat it as a breach. Yes. There will be consequences for Sixth System residents. Yes, I said. There will also be consequences for Sixth System residents if you do not file and the 3-year timeline runs. The calculation on Sevarlin's face was one I recognized. I had seen it in the mirror a few times. The particular math of deciding whether the known bad outcome is better or worse than the unknown one. The question that has no clean answer. What does Earth want? Sevarlin asked. A deposition, I said. On record, everything you know about the hegemony's internal restructuring plans, the Sixth System timeline, any other systems with similar flags, all of it on the Council record where it cannot be quietly archived. And in return, Earth will co-sign the sovereignty petition and will formally advocate for Sixth System representation in any post-resolution negotiations. Post-resolution, Sevarlin said slowly. You believe there will be a resolution. I believe there will be a negotiation, I said. The shape of what comes after depends on what goes into the record before we get there. Right now the record is thin. I would like to make it less thin. Sevarlin was quiet for a long time. The lounge around us was still. Through the small window beside us, the station's exterior lights were coming on as the rotation cycle moved toward the artificial night period. Little by little, the black outside got deeper and the lights got brighter, and the reflection of the two of us, human and Vreth, sitting across a table from each other, became clearer in the glass. I have documentation, Sevarlin said finally. Internal administrative files. I have been carrying them for 4 months. I did not know who to give them to. I let out a breath I had been holding since I sat down. You give them to me, I said, tonight before the morning session. Sevarlin nodded, not a diplomatic nod, a real one. One more thing, I said. Tell me about the other systems, the ones like the Sixth. Are there more with flags? Sevarlin looked at me. 5 more, Sevarlin said quietly. All mid-ring, all resource territories, all with populations that have been in place long enough to have a culture the hegemony does not recognize as Vreth. 5 more. 5 more communities that had been given their own version of a quiet timeline. 5 more populations that did not know the date that had already been written for them in an administrative file somewhere in the inner systems. I thought about what my aunt had said, the open door. This was the door. All right, I said, tell me everything. The morning session began at the standard hour. I had not slept. This was not unusual. I had learned a long time ago that sleep was a resource to be managed like any other, allocated to the periods where it would do the most good, and the night before a session that would either change the shape of the next decade or end my career with maximum efficiency was not a sleep period. It was a working period. Colin and I had been up until 2 hours before the session, organizing Sevarlin's documentation into a format that the Council archive system would accept, drafting the Sixth System sovereignty petition, and preparing the supplemental materials I intended to place on the record. Colin looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours and was running entirely on the idea that stopping was not an option. I told him he was doing well. He looked like he did not entirely believe me, which showed good judgment. Sevarlin had returned to the Vreth delegation's quarters before sunrise. We had agreed it was important that Sevarlin not appear to be aligned with Earth visibly until the deposition was formally on the record. After that, the alignment was a legal fact and could not be quietly managed away. I sat at the Earth position in the chamber and watched the other delegations file in. The 3 delegations who had flagged Collins' calm during the previous session arrived with an extra member each. That was the tell. When a delegation brings an additional body to a session, it means they intend to commit to something. One of the 3, the Ullith group from the outer mid-ring, had brought 4 extra members. I noted that and said nothing. Vreth Kalos entered last. She took her position and looked across the chamber at me with an expression I could not fully read, which was unusual. I had gotten reasonably good at reading Vreth formal expressions in the past 48 hours. The chair called the session. I requested the floor. I placed Sevarlin's documentation on the council record. Every file, the 6 system timeline, the 5 additional systems with administrative flags, the internal hegemony restructuring plans, dated and internally authored, not speculation but formal planning documents. I read the key sections aloud into the record because the council archive can be searched, but it can also be buried, and I wanted these words to have been spoken in open session by a recognized diplomatic representative. The chamber was very quiet while I spoke. When I finished, I formally filed the 6th System's sovereignty petition on behalf of Earth as co-sponsor. Then I sat down. The silence lasted for 11 seconds. I counted. Then the chamber did what chambers do when something fundamental has shifted, which is that everyone started talking at once. The dome above went through 4 color changes in quick succession. The Kreth delegation was on their feet. 2 of the outer ring delegations had their communications open and were relaying to their home governments in real time. Vreth Kalos did not move. She sat at the hegemony position with all 17 tentacles arranged in perfect stillness and looked at the place where I had been standing. The chair called for order 3 times before it took effect. When the chamber settled, it settled into a different shape than it had been in before. The Ullith delegation formally requested association with the Earth diplomatic file. The Preth delegation, who had not flagged Collins' calm but who had been watching from the 3rd gallery with what I now recognized as intense attention, submitted a formal statement of concern regarding hegemony administrative practices in mid-ring territories. 4 words in the statement landed differently than everything else. We have our own flags. The Preth home system was in the mid-ring, not hegemony territory, adjacent to it. I wrote a note and passed it to Colin. He read it and his eyes widened. He wrote back, "How did you know?" I wrote back, "I did not, but if it is true for the 6th system and 5 others, it is probably true for someone outside the hegemony too." He looked at me. "File a formal inquiry with the Preth delegation," I said quietly. "Tonight, before they have time to decide. It is safer to say nothing." He nodded and started typing. The session ran for 4 more hours. By the end of it, the hegemony's original announcement, the neat 6-month timeline, the courtesy notification, the thing already decided and already moving, had become something else entirely. It was on the record. It was contested. It had documentation attached to it that contradicted the hegemony's own formal account of its internal structure. Vreth Kalos finally spoke near the end of the session. She requested a full procedural pause in the sovereignty challenge proceedings to allow for internal hegemony review. In council terms, this was not a stall. A procedural pause in a sovereignty challenge, requested by the challenged party, was a formal signal. It meant the challenged party was reconsidering the cost of proceeding. It meant someone in the hegemony's inner systems had done the math and found that the math no longer worked the way it had worked before Sevarlin's documents landed on the public record. The chair granted it. I walked out of the chamber into the corridor. A Chavel was waiting there, the Kreth intelligence minister. She had not been waiting for me that I could tell. She had been standing in the corridor looking at nothing, the way a person stands when they are processing something too large to hold comfortably. She looked at me when I emerged. "Commander Osai," she said. "Minister Chavel," I said. She was quiet for a moment. My threat assessment, she said, the 12 pages. It was thorough, I said. It was wrong, she said. It was not an apology. It was a professional observation delivered with complete precision. Not in its data, in its frame. I modeled your species as a military entity. I should have modeled it as an adaptive system. The distinction matters, I said. Yes, she paused. I am revising the assessment, 47 pages, possibly more. She looked at me steadily. I wanted you to know that I take my errors seriously. So do I said. It is how you keep from repeating them. She held my gaze for a moment longer, and then she gave a small, precise nod and walked away down the corridor. Colin appeared at my shoulder. Sevarlin's deposition has been formally logged. The Sixth System petition is live on the public record. Good. The Preth delegation replied to the inquiry. They want a meeting tonight. Set it up. You should also know, he said carefully, that the hegemonies recalled 3 of its mid-ring fleet units. They were flagged moving toward the outer settlements last week. They've turned around. I stopped walking. All 3, I said. All 3, he said, as of 2 hours ago. The fleets had been moving for months. 8 months of hegemony ships edging toward positions that were not aggressive enough to trigger a council alert, but were consistent enough to be a pattern if you were watching carefully. They had turned around. Not because Earth's military had engaged them. Not because anything had fired. Because a piece of paper had landed on a public record, and the math inside the hegemony had changed, and someone in the inner systems had looked at what was on the council file now and decided that the quiet approach was no longer quiet. I stood in the corridor and thought about that. This was the thing that the 12-page threat assessment had not known how to measure. Not firepower, not fleet tonnage. The specific, patient, grinding way that humans change the cost of a decision without firing a single shot. The paperwork, the petitions, the archive entries and the formal inquiries and the deposition filed by a young HFY HFY who had been carrying documents for 4 months and had not known who to give them to until now. My aunt had told me, the night we left our colony, that the point was not to fight every battle. The point was to make sure that when someone calculated the cost of taking something from you, the number they arrived at was always higher than they expected. The fleets had turned around. I started walking again. What else? I said. Colin looked at his tablet. Ullith, Preth, and 2 other delegations are asking about a formal statement of collective security, something on the council record that links their territorial concerns to the open sovereignty challenge. That is called a block, I said. Yes. Draft a framework document tonight, something they can all sign without committing to a specific military posture, flexible language, enough structure to be real, enough room that nobody feels locked in before they are ready. He made notes. And Colin. Yes, ma'am. Get some sleep at some point. That is a direct order. He looked surprised. Then he smiled. It was a tired smile, the kind that takes some effort to produce, but it was real. Yes, ma'am, he said. I walked to the end of the corridor and stood at the observation window. The station turned slowly in its orbit, and through the window, the star at the center of this system moved across the frame with the patient regularity of things that have been doing their job for a very long time. Everything else moved around it. The station, the ships, the delegations and their calculations and their flags and their carefully worded documents. Somewhere out there, Earth's fleets were still loaded and waiting. They would not be needed. That was the part no threat assessment had ever gotten right about humans. Not the fighting. The preference, deep and genuine and rooted in every hard lesson the species had ever learned from fighting itself, for the outcome where the fighting did not happen. Where the cost had been raised high enough that the person on the other side of the calculation looked at the number and decided the thing was not worth taking. The fleets had turned around. I pressed my comm and opened the channel to my aunt. She answered on the first ring. "The sixth system petition is on the record," I said. "5 more systems flagged. 3 hegemony fleets recalled. The Preth delegation wants a meeting." She was quiet for a moment. "Come home when this is done," she said. "I will," I said. "There are 18 follow-up meetings first." She laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind that sounds like it surprised the person producing it. "There always are," she said. The star moved across the window. I stayed at the glass for a little while longer. Then I went to prepare for the Preth meeting, because the work was not done, and work that is not done does not do itself, and there were more rooms to read before the rooms had a chance to read me. The Galactic Council's new charter passed 41 days later, 16 votes above the required threshold. Earth got a permanent seat. Not a courtesy seat, not a gesture, a seat with full deliberative weight, a seat that had to be reckoned with, a seat that had been earned in the most human way imaginable, not by being the biggest force in the room, but by making the room's existing forces recalculate everything they thought they knew. The Vreth hegemony signed the new charter. Vreth Kalos signed it personally. She did not look at me when she signed it. I did not need her to. The sixth system filed its formal sovereignty declaration the same afternoon. 5 more systems followed within the week. Sev Arlen was named interim representative for the sixth system's council observer status, which was not a full membership but was a beginning, and beginnings were what mattered. Ashavel's revised threat assessment of Earth ran to 47 pages. I did not read it. Not because I was not curious, but because what it said about my species was something I already knew, had always known, had been carrying since I was 9 years old, watching my aunt pack 2 bags in 11 minutes without once looking like she was beaten. We are hard to predict. We are very hard to model. We do not fight every battle. We change the cost of taking something from us until the cost is higher than anyone is willing to pay. And we do it with paperwork and petitions and 22-minute speeches and warm cups of not quite right beverages slid across tables in quiet rooms. And we do it because we have had a very long time to learn what works and what costs too much and what you have to become to win the wrong way. Colin met me in the corridor after the signing ceremony. He looked like a person who had aged approximately 4 years in 41 days and was at peace with that. 18 follow-up meetings, he said. 19 now, I said. The Dreth delegation filed a request this morning. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them, nodded. Coffee first, he said. Coffee first, I said. We walked toward the lounge. Behind us, through the dome above the council chamber, the bioluminescent gas was cycling through a color I had not seen before that first eruption, the color that was not on the cultural briefing chart, the one between gold and green. I had asked about it, eventually. The station's cultural liaison had told me that the dome color had not been recorded in the active archives because it had not appeared in a very long time. It meant, roughly translated, something new is beginning. I had filed that away. I did not mention it to Colin. He would figure it out. They always do.